Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we delve further into the wisdom of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply appreciate your support. Please take a moment to like and share this audiobook, helping us expand its reach and granting more individuals access to its profound insights. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for instant notifications when new content is released. Together, we can disseminate the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community dedicated to enlightenment and inner peace. Your participation in our mission to make these transformative teachings universally accessible is truly invaluable. Let's begin today's reading. Protection through mindfulness practice. December 24, 2015. The Buddha often talks about the practice of satipatthana, or the establishing of mindfulness, as a kind of protection. He says that you make yourself a refuge when you practice the establishing of mindfulness. You make yourself an island, a safe place in the middle of the ood. There's also the passage where he tells the story of two acrobats. As each acrobat maintains his or her own sense of balance, each is protecting him or herself, and also provides a protection for the other. This, too, the Buddha then says, is an analogy for the establishing of mindfulness. So, what kind of protection does mindfulness provide? Here it's useful to note that when the Buddha talked about the duties of a teacher, one of them is to provide protection for the student in all directions. In his own case, this meant that he gave the student clear reasons for what should and shouldn't be done, lessons that the student could take along wherever he'd go, and that would be valid in whatever direction he went. After all, we go through life active, not passive. We're shaping our experience, so we need guidance as to what ways will provide us with happiness in the long term and help us avoid soaring in the long term. The main danger in life is our own lack of knowledge in this area, or even worse, believing that our actions don't matter or have no results. That's really dangerous, a lot more dangerous than the dangers other people can pose to us. So this question of protection has to apply to what you're doing with your mind right now. This is where the establishing of mindfulness provides a really good protection, because when we look at the three qualities that go into establishing mindfulness: ardency, alertness, and mindfulness, we can see that they're not just matters of accepting or resigning ourselves to whatever comes up. They give guidance as to what to do, right here, right now. Mindfulness is what keeps in mind the ability to recognize things, the labels we have for naming things as they come up in the present moment. That's the RST step. The second step is that, once you've recognized what something is, mindfulness reminds you of what should or shouldn't be done with it. It reminds you not only what you've read in the texts or heard from teachers, but also what you've learned on your own in your practice, as to what works and what doesn't work, in giving rise to skillful qualities. That's how your power of memory is a protector. Then there's alertness. Alertness watches what's actually happening, and in particular, what you're doing and the results you're getting from what you're doing. You might say that it takes note of what's happening and then sends the information over to mindfulness. Mindfulness then recognizes what's going on and gives instruction as for what should be done. If something is unskillful, and you recognize it as something unskillful, then you remember that it's something you've got to get rid of, and you try to remember how. And nally, ardency is what does what should be done. So these three qualities working together all provide you with your own protection. And their interaction goes further. Once ardency has done something well, alertness notes that. When it's done something not so well, alertness will note that, too. Then you send that information over to mindfulness to remember. So you want to strengthen these qualities as much as you can, because if you're missing any of them, you're left without protection. Each of them provides protection in its own particular way. For example, in some cases you may not be able to recognize if something is skillful or not. You can't recognize what's happening, and in this case, your protection is to be really, really alert. That means that you have to watch it for a while, as in Ajahn Mun's advice to Ajahn Mahabua. If something comes up in your meditation, and you're not sure about it, watch it. Stay with that sense of awareness, the observer, the knower, and don't be too quick to come to any conclusions until you can see what's actually happening. Ultimately, you'll recognize it as something skillful or unskillful, something to be developed or something to be abandoned, but be careful not to jump too quickly to conclusions. That's alertness over the long term. There are also the times when alertness has to be very quick, as in Upasaka's advice. When something comes up in the meditation that seems really good, or an insight comes up that's really compelling, note what happens immediately after that. In other words, you've got to be alert continuously. You can't go riding with a sense of, say, pride, or a sense of total conviction in the insight. Look for cause and effect in the very act of having an insight. Try to see what happens as a result of believing that insight. So, there are times when alertness provides protection by being long-term, and other times when it provides protection by being very quick. You really can't lack any of these three qualities. If you forget what you've learned from the past, you're totally defenseless. At the same time, if you know what should be done but you don't carry it through, then you're not really protecting yourself either. So you have to work on all these three qualities together. One main problem is that when something comes up in the mind, we tend to think of it in terms of our own vocabulary. Lust comes up and our vocabulary says that it's something good. Anger comes up, and even though part of us may think that it's not all that good, another part of us really likes it. This is why mindfulness, remembering the Buddha's vocabulary for these things, has to be strong. It enables you to recognize when there's something that, for the sake of the practice, you don't want to follow, and it reminds you of the tools you have to deal with it. When lust comes up, for instance, the mind can create all kinds of reasons for why the object of lust is really attractive. You've got to remember to recognize it as a hindrance, and to recall that if you follow through with it, it's going to create a lot of trouble. Among the tools that mindfulness can use to help you here is the ability to remember that lust has its dangers. Here it's good to think of all the stupid things people do under the power of lust and the awful situations they get themselves into, getting tied down to a person they thought was attractive, and then discovering what else there is in that person. The person's background, personality, family, all the connections that come bundled with that person. That helps you realize how risky it is. When this really hits home, you'll be a little more likely to want to actually apply that meditation in the chant right now, on the different parts of the body. First, think about your own body. What's in there that's really worthy of lust? Take out all the parts and examine them to see which of them could be really attractive. Only then do you apply the same contemplation to the other person, which is what makes it fair. In other words, you're not saying that the other gender or the other person is the bad one. Your body, too, has the same sort of stua. But as the Buddha says, this analysis is going to work only if you have an alternative source of pleasure. This is why we work with the breath. The two contemplations have to go together. All too often, when you're really tired or stressed out, you say to yourself that the pleasure that comes from the lust is really worth it, it's something you really need, you want your quick X. But if you can take a few minutes to stop and just breathe in a way that's really refreshing, really nourishing, you give yourself some relief, you give yourself some strength, you give yourself some food, and then that enables you to say to yourself, actually, I don't really need that other kind of pleasure after all. This is why ardency in developing concentration can be your RST line protection against lust. As the Buddha said, you can know all the drawbacks of sensuality, but if you don't have an alternative form of pleasure, all that knowledge is worthless. So ardency here also has to develop concentration, a sense of non-sensual well-being, working with the breath. We've talked for the last couple of days in the Q&A about different ways of working with the breath energy, and it's important to take some time to explore this aspect of your relationship to your body. What kind of movement of the breath is actually helpful? What kind of movement of the breath makes it more difficult to stay with the body? And learn to play. Take the breath energy in the body as your playground here, and be open to new ideas about how the breath energy can move. You'll notice, in Ajahn Lee's basic instructions, that he talks about the breath energy going down the spine and down the legs as you breathe in. But it can also do that as you breathe out. There are other times when he talks about the breath energy starting in the soles of the feet, coming up the legs and up the spine, in the other direction. You may read in manuals on Tai Chi that there's an energy circle running from the navel down to the spot between the legs and then back up the spine, and down the front of the torso to the navel. But in your own case, you may ND that, as you breathe in, a certain part of the energy can run a circle that goes up the front and down the back, or up the back and down the front, whichever way you want the energy to go. There are lots of different ways you can work with the energy. Don't limit yourself. The more variety you can ND in dealing with the breath, the more intriguing it will be to stay with the body, and the more you'll be able to ND a sense of well-being for the body, giving it just what it needs at any particular time. This allows you to step back, say, from your anger or lust, and look at the other physical and mental symptoms that you've put together to create that lustful or angry state to begin with. After all, these are things that we fabricate. We're really good at putting them together. A little sensation here, a little sensation there, you tie them together, and there you are. Lust is overcoming you. It's laid claim to your body and to your mind. You've suddenly got all that pressure inside that you've got to do something about. The same with anger. This person did that, and then you can stitch all the that's together into a big story, and it gets your blood boiling. There was a report recently about how people with strong bouts of anger are more likely to have a heart attack a couple of hours later. The researchers said they didn't know what the connection was, although it's pretty obvious. We stitch all these things together, and then all the stitched together parts block the energy out, pressure builds up, and something explodes. All it takes is a little random sensation here and there, and the mind has learned how to be really good at stitching them into a web to catch itself. We've been doing this for who knows how many lifetimes. But if you have a sense of well-being with the breath, then you can step back from these fabrications. You begin to take them apart to cut through all the connections you've created. Ask yourself, what was the RST sensation in the body? What was the RST little thought in the mind? The little whisper of thought that suggested that lust might be a good antidote for whatever sense of irritation you're feeling, or that anger would be an appropriate response for what someone's done. And how does that work its way through your inner bureaucracy? Influencing this person, that person inside, all those committee members working together, creating little sensations here and there, and all of a sudden you've got a full-blown case. If you want to believe their propaganda when that happens, you're throwing away your protection. Your protection is to remind yourself, this is an unskillful state, and you have to be alert. One of the things you remember with mindfulness is that if you stay with the body, or in particular, stay with the breath, you're going to be here in the present moment. That way, when these things happen, you'll see them in time, and you'll be alert to upcoming trends. If you see that things are going in a bad direction, you can turn them around. This is how these three qualities keep spinning around the mind and the body, working to give you the protection you need from things like lust, aversion, delusion, greed, all the unskillful things that come welling up inside that you've been so good at creating, and that create so many dangers for yourself. This is why, when Ajahn Lee was writing about the establishing of mindfulness, he kept hammering away at these three qualities: mindfulness, alertness, ardency. Mindfulness, alertness, ardency. They lie at the essence of how the establishing of mindfulness can provide you with a protection and be your refuge, your island in the middle of the river, or, as they say in another passage in the canon, your island in the middle of a lake. The lake is rising, but you've got this island that provides you with a refuge so that you don't have to drown in the lake. So don't abandon it. Think of that image of the quail being hunted by a hawk. As long as the quail stays in its safe territory, the hawk can't get it. But as soon as it wanders out, there's no guarantee. And what does it mean to wander out of your safe territory? To get fascinated with sights, sounds, smells, tastes. Tactile sensations, all the raw materials for things like passion and diversion. If you do that, the hawk can get you. But if you stay in your proper territory, the establishing of mindfulness, you're safe. Of course, it's not just a place. It's also a combination of activities here in the mind. They're your protectors. So nourish them well. Recollection of the Buddha. October 30, 2014. Recollection of the Buddha is one of the guardian meditations. What does it guard you from? It guards you from your own dilemmas. It's good to stop and think about the Buddha because he sets the pattern for what we're doing here in our practice. If you look around the world to see who you might want to take as an example, you can't end a better one. As you react on the Buddha, it gives rise to conviction, which is one of the inner strengths that keeps you on the path, keeps you going. And it also gives you a sense of direction. We're not just trusting the Buddha, we're trusting in his awakening. That he really was awakened, he knew what he was talking about, he really was able to end a deathless element inside that led to true peace, true happiness, an end of suffering. And as a teacher he was very wise. He knew which issues to take up, which issues to put aside, how to frame issues, so that they would actually be helpful in leading to the end of suffering. There are so many issues you can get involved in, so many debates, so many lines of thinking, lines of exploration you can follow, that would pull you away from the main issue, which is the end of suffering. And even with issues that are related to the end of suffering, you can frame them in ways that pull you away. So the Buddha was wise not only in what he taught, but also what he didn't teach, how he framed what he taught. Ajahn Suwat used to say that if you don't believe anybody else, if you don't trust anybody else, at least trust the Buddha. Place yourself in his hands. You put yourself in good hands. You follow what he taught and you can't go wrong. So it's good to contemplate this on a regular basis. There are a lot of people who say, well, the Buddha was okay for his time and place, but now. We live in a modern world and there are certain assumptions we have to hold to as part of being modern people. I never knew that I had checked into the human world on the condition that I had to accept a modern worldview. One of the facts of the modern world is that we're exposed to lots of different teachings. And so we have the right to choose our assumptions, what we're going to assume is a well-lived life, what we're going to assume is a good example for how we live. We have the choice. And there's nothing that commits us to an otherwise modern worldview. So there's no need to say, we have to strip away the Buddha's teachings in the same way you might pluck a chicken, leaving only the parts that tie into a modern worldview. After all, the modern worldview is one that's creating a lot of suffering for us. If you believe that all you are is a body and that your consciousness is just an epiphenomenon, as they call it, a side effect of there being a body, then you can't really believe that by training the mind, you're going to have any impact on anything at all, because in the materialist view, the only reality is physical reality. Yet if you believe that the physical reality is the only one, it makes you miserable. What can you do? You're stuck. Now some people like to be stuck. It lets them off the hook, they don't have to be responsible for their choices. But that's a miserable place to be stuck. Just look at your mind. What does your mind deal in? It deals with meanings. Someone can say a word, and it will have a huge impact on what goes on in your mind. Now, physically, the word itself is what? Sound waves hitting the ear, that's it. We can take the same word, so that the sound waves are the same, but if you put it in one language, it means one thing, if you put it in another one it means something else. And if everything were just physical, how could that be? How could there be meanings? The mind deals with meanings. So take on the meaning of what the Buddha said, that it is possible to end a true happiness, and it's possible to do it from within. In other words, by changing your mind with your mind. Now that doesn't tie in with a lot of modern materialist assumptions, but again, why are we committed to, say, a materialist assumption, just because we're born in this time and place? We have the right to choose any assumptions that help alleviate suffering now and on into the future. So the Buddha's assumptions are really wise. And as for parts of the teaching that people would have us put aside, the Buddha had good reasons for teaching them. Take, for instance, the whole issue of the different levels of being. I have a student who started meditating on his own when he was a teenager. He started sensing beings around him. Having been raised in the Catholic Church, all he knew was that spiritual beings came in only two sorts, really good or really bad, and there was nothing in between. And these certainly didn't look like the good ones, so he opted out. As a result, he stopped meditating. Later, after he realized that there are other ways of looking at these beings, that there are all kinds of beings out there, good, bad, and all the shades in between, he was able to start meditating again without fear of what he was seeing. The Buddha gives you instructions on how to deal with beings like this. How not to be overcome by them, how not to be afraid of them, how to be wary around them even as you wish them well, how to protect yourself from them. These are all there in the teaching. And the worldview the Buddha gives in this regard is very useful. There are not just angels or demons. There are lots of different levels, with beings at many stages in terms of their goodness and knowledge. It's like having lots of different kinds of neighbors, the same as you'd have in the human realm. So that worldview can be extremely useful for people who are sensitive in this way. So when we recollect the Buddha, we realize that our conviction in his awakening is our protection. There are a lot of things we don't know in life, but we have to make assumptions in order to function. We have our choice of assumptions, and the assumptions the Buddha recommends make sense. He's not asking you to believe anything impossible. He's asking you to believe in the power of your own action. He also gives BCC guidance in how best to act, so you don't have to reinvent the Dhamma wheel every time you start practicing. So this recollection of the Buddha is a good protection. It protects us from that attitude that says, well, if I don't know something, I'm not going to believe it. The fact is, there are a lot of things that you don't know. If you start examining your beliefs, you realize that you make lots of assumptions as you go through the day. So you might as well adopt some assumptions that have been tried and passed the test. The people who say that the Buddha is really worthless, they themselves, as people, aren't very impressive. For instance, it was Ajahn Suwat who said, if you don't believe anybody, at least believe the Buddha. He himself had believed the Buddha all the way down the line, and he'd been taught greatly from it. And he was a very inspiring example, much more inspiring than the people who would say, well, pick and choose, take what you like and throw away what you don't like. This is how we protect ourselves from ourselves. We protect the good part inside us, the part that wants to end a true happiness, and we protect it from all the greed and aversion and delusion and laziness and other unskillful qualities that would pull us away. So recollection of the Buddha is one of the most important weapons in our arsenal. Bring it out to use on a regular basis, and you'll indeed that it gives energy and safety to your practice. The World of Conviction. March 27, 2017. One of the mind's habits is to create states of becoming, involving both the world outside and your own inner world, the world of the mind. You start with a desire and then, based on that desire, you take on an identity in a BCC world of experience. If you have a desire for pizza, the you in that world is going to be both the you that's going to enjoy the pizza when you get it, and the you that can get the pizza. You have the skills, or you have the wherewithal, to get it for yourself. That's a self as producer. The one who's going to taste the pizza, that's the self as consumer. As for the world, once you've focused on that desire, everything in the world that's relevant to that desire actually forms the world in that becoming. Whatever is either going to help you get the pizza or get in the way of getting the pizza forms the foreground. Everything else falls into the background. Everything else in your own personal identity that's irrelevant to that desire at that point falls into the background, too. Then when you move on to another desire, there's another becoming with another you and a different world. The mind's doing this all the time. And then on the larger scale, there's the you here as a human being, along with the world outside that you're inhabiting as a human being. That's also a kind of becoming. One of the Buddha's main insights was that these two are connected. The identity that you have as a human being right now is based on a lot of the becomings you had in the past in your mind. And, as the Buddha said, this process of becoming entails suffering, because that desire, when you cling to it, is going to be uncertain. The clinging, too, is uncertain. It's going to be unstable. So anything built around that, anything that gathers around that, will have to be unstable as well. This is why clinging lies at the essence of suffering. But it also turns out that you need to develop certain becomings in order to practice. The you who's here meditating, the inner world of your mind that you're inhabiting right now, along with the world of the breath, should be prominent, and other things should fall into the background. The concentration you're aiming at, too, is a kind of becoming. In fact, you actually see the process of becoming very clearly as you try to meditate because, as you often discover, when you're trying to stay with the breath all of a sudden you end yourself in some other place in a different world. That's because a different desire took over and a new you formed around that, a new world formed around that, and took you So you keep trying to re-establish yourself here not only as you're meditating, but also as you go through the world and keep trying to practice. The you as a meditator is something you want to encourage, something you want to nourish. The you that can do this. The canon encourages that kind of thinking, other people can do this. Why can't I? The Buddha also encourages you to remember that you've embarked on this practice because you want to get past suffering. If you end yourself wanting to leave the practice or to slack then you have to ask yourself, don't you really love yourself? Don't you really care about yourself? This is called the self as a governing principle. So these are forms of selfing or I-making and my-making in the Buddha's terms that are actually helpful on the path. But there's also the process of world-making. What kind of world can you inhabit that's going to be helpful for the path? Here at the monastery, we have the context of the monastery. But when you leave, you've got to take a world with you. This is one of the reasons why the Buddha talks about the V-strengths or the V-faculties. These are qualities that nourish the mind and nourish the kind of becoming that you want as a practitioner as you go through the world. Both lists the strengths and the faculties begin with conviction. Conviction in the Buddha's awakening, that he really was awakened. If you hold on to that conviction, it creates a different world around you. You see things through that lens, and they're going to look different from what they would have if you lived in a world where no one had ever awakened through his or her own ears. What does it mean to have conviction in the Buddha's awakening? Well, it comes down to conviction in the principle of action, that your actions really do make a difference. They can make such a huge difference that they can actually put an end to suffering. And you can do this on your own. After all, the Buddha did it on his own. Even though he said that the whole of the holy life lies in having admirable friends, the admirable friends are there simply to point out the way and to give good advice, to set good examples. But the actual work is something you have to do. You have to do it on your own. This is the message of the Buddha's awakening. And you notice, if you look through Buddhist history, that when people try to change the Dhamma, especially into forms that said, you can't do this on your own. You need some outside power to come and help you, they also change the story of the Buddha's awakening. There's one version where, as the Bodhisattva is sitting under the tree, he doesn't gain awakening there. He gets spirited up to the pure abodes. There he gets surrounded by Buddhas of the past who beam awakening into his head. Then he comes back down. In other words, in that version, he didn't do it on his own. There's another version where he actually was awakened before he left home. He was having tantric sex in the palace with a consort, and, through tantric sex, he appealed to the Buddhas of the past, who shared their awakening with him. Then he went out and sat under the Bodhi tree as a show for people who might be inspired by that kind of thing. So, you can see how important the story of the Buddha's awakening is in creating the world in which you practice. Recently, I was reading a secular Buddhist version of the Buddha's life, in which there actually was no awakening. The Buddha was just a well-meaning sort of guy who thought about things a lot and was very sensitive, and now he decided that each of us has to be true to ourselves and end a path, our own path, for ourselves. Nobody else can tell us what the path should be. But unfortunately, he was not a good teacher, and the monks took his teachings and distorted them, telling us that there was an awakening and a species truth to the awakening, and that there was a path that worked for everybody. What kind of world would that be if nobody ever really gained awakening? A pretty hopeless one. If you really are serious about putting an end to sewering, conviction in the original story of the Buddha's awakening creates a new world around you. You see your life as an opportunity to develop the qualities that he developed. In the canon, when the Buddha talks about the qualities that led him to awakening, they come down to being heedful, ardent, and resolute. When you believe that the Buddha really did gain awakening through these qualities, it encourages you to develop those qualities in your life as well. Heedful to take care in what you do, ardent to give rise to what's good in any circumstance, resolute to keep from being swayed by your dilemmas and other people's opinions. This is especially important as we live here in this land of wrong view, where truth gets turned into truthiness, the virtues are called into question, and everybody says, well, just end your own way and go for the immediate hit. And they accuse Buddhism of being pessimistic. The Buddha's actually saying, look, through your ears, you can gain true happiness. You can put an end to all sewering. Here's how it's done. And human beings can do it. That's the other message of the Buddha's awakening. That it is possible for us to touch a deathless dimension within the mind. The path can take us there. Sometimes you hear the question, how can a human being, which is a conditioned being, know something unconditioned? That wasn't the Buddha's approach. Instead of trying to know what a human being is and, from that, what a human being can know, his approach was to begin with, what can a human being know? And then, after that, if you want, you can know what a human being is. But he found that by denying yourself in any way you're placing limitations on yourself. So why bother trying to deny yourself? But if you focus on developing a general sense of yourself as capable, as willing to take responsibility for your actions, and to learn from mistakes, simple things like that, which involve a quality of integrity, that kind of self can actually take you to the point where you don't need it anymore. Because, after all, why do we create selves in our becomings? Because we want happiness based on our desires, and we need a sense of the self as producer and self as consumer to achieve what we want. But when you get to a happiness that doesn't require any conditions, you don't have to create any sense of self around it. That's why the Buddha gave the teaching on not self. But to get to the point where you apply not self to everything, you have to learn how to create a good self, a skillful sense of self, and, at the same time, have a skillful sense of the world around you, a world in which awakening is possible. Now this is a matter of conviction. You're not going to know the truth of the Buddha's awakening until you end awakening yourself. But faith in awakening before that point is not the kind of faith where you're being asked to believe anything unreasonable. It's a reasonable working hypothesis, which helps get you on the path, keeps you on the path, and leaves the possibility of awakening open. If you take that other working hypothesis that nobody ever has really gained awakening, that it's all just a bunch of made-up stew that closes all the doors. So you have to decide, which kind of person do you want to be? And which kind of world do you want to live in? You do have that much of a choice. You can create an environment for your practice in this way, based on your conviction. You may end that you'll be living in a world that's different from the worlds of the people around you, but we're already living in worlds different from theirs, the worlds of our own becomings. The question is, in creating your becomings, do you want to follow their worlds, with their limited possibilities? Or do you want to live in the world of the Buddha, in which the possibilities are wide open and you're capable? The choice is yours. And since we're already creating worlds of becoming and selves of becoming over and over again and soaring as a result, why not create a becoming that leaves the potential open to get beyond becoming and soaring altogether? It gives a new meaning to your selfing, and it gives a new meaning to the worlding that you do. It leaves open the possibility that there are other dimensions of the mind aside from the worlds we keep creating for ourselves. There's a dimension that's Lokuttara, above worlds, a dimension that's unfabricated, ultimate happiness, ultimate truth, ultimate freedom. Conviction in the Buddha's awakening leaves that dimension as a possibility. A world without that awakening closes that possibility. So, remember that you're making the choice all the time. What kind of world are you going to live in? And what kind of person are you going to be in that world? Don't let other people make that choice for you. Listen to the part of your heart that says, I want true happiness. I want to end it in a way that's harmless and wise. And you end that conviction in the Buddha's awakening helps you achieve that desire. Pleasant practice, painful practice. August 6, 2015. There's a sad story about a young American who went to Thailand and became a monk. He went to stay with Ajahn Mahabua, and one of the RST questions he asked Ajahn Mahabua on arrival was, what meditation theme can I follow that will lead me to awakening? Ajahn Mahabua said, I don't know. You have to end out for yourself. Unfortunately, the young monk thought that Ajahn Mahabua was saying that he didn't know the way to awakening, so he got discouraged, left, and ended up disrobing. He tried Zen for several years, disrobed from that, and ended up being a professor of Buddhist studies here in the States. The sad thing, of course, is that he misinterpreted Ajahn Mahabua's statement. Ajahn Mahabua didn't say that he didn't know the way to awakening. What he didn't know was which technique would work specifically for that young monk, seeing that there's no one technique guaranteed to take every meditator to stream entry or once returning or non-returning or arahantship. The technique that works for each individual person is a matter of individual temperament. There are two main practices, as the Buddha denounced them: painful practice and pleasant practice. By this he doesn't mean that you sit here with a lot of pain or with a lot of pleasure. Painful practice means having to contemplate themes like death or the unattractiveness of the body as your main meditation theme. This kind of practice is painful because it's mentally painful. Pleasant practice has to do with getting into the jhanas and working with the sense of ease and refreshment that come from getting the mind really still. Now, this doesn't mean that body contemplation doesn't get you into jhana. In both cases, the Buddha said, what determines whether your practice is going to be pleasant or painful is which kind of contemplation leads you to develop the V strengths and the V faculties: conviction, persistence, mindfulness, concentration, and discernment. Concentration in both cases means the jhanas, but the theme leading you to develop those jhanas, and from there on into discernment, is something that varies. Some people can just work with the jhana itself. You look at whatever state of concentration you have settled into and you examine it to see, where is there still any stress here? You look for what you might be doing to cause this stress, and you notice that by keeping track of the rise and fall of the level of stress in the mind while it's in concentration. If you catch the activity of the mind that brings on the stress, drop that activity right then and there. When you do this, you're learning the basic skill that will take you all the way, at the very least, to stream entry, because it's all about seeing and developing dispassion for the activities of the mind. The same holds true with the concentration that comes from contemplating the body. At RST, you're focused on your image of the body. But then there comes the question, what makes you want to give rise to, say, a perception of the body as unattractive, and what makes you want to develop a perception of it as attractive? What's the instigator? And what is this thing, this perception of attractive and not attractive? You learn to turn around and look at that. Take that apart. In both cases, you're learning how to look at the role of perception in your mind, along with the role of feeling and fabrication, which are the central aggregates in any attempt to free the mind from the aggregates. That makes you more and more sensitive to what the mind is doing to deceive and create unnecessary suffering for itself. As for which of the two main types you fall into, you don't know that beforehand. This is one of the reasons why we practice both body contemplation and breath meditation. Contemplate the 32 parts of the body. You can add other parts of the body if you like. For some reason, eyes are not mentioned in the list, but if you want, you can visualize them to yourself. What the eyes look like without the eyelids. Or you can just go down the standard list. When you focus on a particular body part, ask yourself, where in my sense of the body sitting right here is that part right now? This is to drive home the fact that the body part is not just something in an anatomy chart or a photo. It's something right here in your body. You've been living with your liver, you've been living with your lungs all this time without really thinking much about them. So go through the various parts until you end one part that really captures your interest, that really seems to hit you. My gosh, my body has that too, and I've been carrying it around right inside me. Anything that helps you question your attachment to the body, so that you can stop taking it for granted that your body's a really cool thing. This is not to say the body's a bad thing. After all, you've got to use the body for the practice. What you're trying to cut through are all your unhealthy positive and negative images of your body. Unhealthy negative images center on the idea that it's just me who's ugly. My body's not beautiful like all those other people I see in the media. An unhealthy positive image is saying, I've got this really cool body here. I'm pretty sharp. People deem me attractive, so my body must make me better than other people. Both of those are unhealthy because they lead to unhealthy mind states. A healthy positive image is that I've got a body that I can practice with. A healthy negative image is one that says, we're all equal in terms of what we've got in our bodies, and none of the parts are really all that attractive when you take them out. So the value of the body doesn't lie in its appearance. It lies in what you do with it. It's good to do this practice on a regular basis to help loosen your attachment to the body. It helps with a lot of dilemmas, not just with your attachment to lust. It's interesting to note that the Buddha's analysis of lust is that you start with your attraction to your own body, and then you transfer that to the body of the opposite sex or whatever the sex you're attracted to. But it starts with your own body. This analysis is not just for lust. It's also for pride, such as the pride of racism. Skin is just skin, and nobody's skin is attractive when it's put in a pile. Whatever kind of attachment you have to the body, it may be the unwillingness to do without food or to do without sleep for fear that it's going to harm the body. You tell yourself, well, the body's here to be used. And there comes a point where you're going to have to throw it away anyhow. So use it in a good way while you can. People put so much energy into trying to preserve their bodies. But what are they preserving them for, usually? In most cases, they're just preserving them so they look good until they admit to themselves that they can't really look good anymore. That doesn't accomplish anything. So you have to ask yourself, to what extent am I unwilling to use the body for something that will really have a good impact on the mind? Then look at the various parts of the body and see that there's really nothing here that's worth holding on to for its own sake. Learn to see the body as a tool. This is all very helpful, even if your basic practice is pleasant. Regardless of whether a painful or a pleasant theme ultimately sparks your awakening, either way you've got to do this kind of contemplation on a regular basis. The same in the other case. Even if your practice is painful, the Buddha says that you've got, at the very least, to have the breath as your escape, because there are times when body contemplation can get the mind really disturbed. It can lead to unskillful mind states, and that's when you've got to drop that theme for the time being and come back to the breath. Give yourself a sense of well-being, of refreshing the mind, because the mind needs its refreshment on the path. After all, it's going to be feeding anyhow. And if it doesn't have something really good to feed on in terms of the concentration, it's going to go slipping out, jumping over the wall, needing something outside to feed of, to end its hit of pleasure. So give it something good right here. Something that's visceral, immediate, and skillful, something that helps anchor you in the present moment and puts you in a position where you really can see what's going on in the mind, because the breath is the closest thing in the body to the mind. It's through the breath, or the energy of the breath, that you can actually move your body and be sensitive to what's going on in the body. So staying with the breath focuses you right next to the mind, at the same time creating a good relationship between the body and the mind. So whether your practice is going to be painful or pleasant, it's good to have some experience with both sides, both because nobody can know which side you're on, and because it helps give balance to both sides. Be alive to the fact that there are lots of different ways, lots of different themes for training the mind. There are many different themes in the suttas. It's even possible to work with metta or any of the Brahma Viharas as the basis for your concentration. As long as you then use that concentration as a basis for further developing the factors for awakening, and in particular, discernment about what you're doing, as you create a state of mind that, too, can be one of the pleasant ways of gaining awakening. But it all has to come down to your ability to watch your own mind, as it's creating unnecessary stress and soaring through its perceptions and feelings and fabrications here in the present moment. Whichever theme leads you to that level of awareness and makes it easy for you to see what you're doing and where the unnecessary stress is and how you don't have to create it. That'll be the method that works. A part of the Buddha's greatness as a teacher was his realization that there are many different personality tendencies, and his ability to provide different ways of dealing with your different tendencies, so that regardless of your tendency, there is a way for you to reach awakening. Goodwill is restraint. July 25, 2015. There's a passage where the Buddha talks about the development of goodwill and by implication all the other sublime attitudes as a form of restraint. We don't usually think about goodwill in those terms. We think of it more as an opening of the heart, letting all its natural goodness come pouring out. But then, of course, the Buddha never said anything about natural goodness. He said the mind is very changeable. It's capable of all kinds of things, and it can change so quickly that even saying, "in the ash of an eye" is too slow. And as for pouring out, that's what the word asava means, and that's something we're trying to overcome. So what are we restraining as we develop goodwill? Basically, if we have thoughts of ill will in the mind, they're going to come pouring out in our actions. And so, instead of just holding the ill will in mind as you try to prevent it from affecting your actions, you try to nip it in the bud. You're sitting here and things come up in your mind about something that someone did or someone else said, and it gets you really worked up. You need a way to restrain yourself. And that's what goodwill is for. Similarly, the idea of wanting to do harm to somebody may come up. You need compassion again, both for yourself and for the other person. Resentment comes up for somebody's good fortune. You feel they got something that you should have had, or you see that they've got some position that you don't think they deserve. Well, develop empathetic joy. If any aversion comes up for anybody, the Buddha says to develop equanimity. They're all very interesting pairings. Especially the equanimity for aversion. We're usually told that goodwill is the antidote for anger. But sometimes there are cases where someone has done something, and it's really hard to feel goodwill for that person. But at the very least you can say, "Okay, I'm just not going to get involved for the time being." And remember that everybody has his or her own karma. But there's another kind of restraint as well. And that has to do with remembering that you've done wrong to somebody, and you want to resolve not to do it again. This is where the Buddha again recommends developing all the Brahma Viharas as a way of maintaining the vow you've made to restrain yourself from making that same mistake in the future. When you've wronged somebody else, it's very easy to start thinking that you're a really bad person, and that gets you down. And then, to get out of that mood, you start telling yourself, "Well, maybe the other person deserved what I did." But you don't want to think in that way, either. So you have to develop goodwill for both sides. Goodwill for yourself means what? Thinking about what genuine happiness comes from and what you need to do in order to end it. And making the resolve that you really do want to end that happiness. Goodwill for other people, of course, means that you don't want to harm them, and you don't want to get them to do harm, either, because that would get in the way of their true happiness. Of course, they have their own free will to make choices, but to whatever extent you can have an influence, you want to make that influence good. And remember that the goodwill is there for you. Even though you're directing it to somebody else, it's for the sake of your own skillfulness. Because as you train the mind, there are going to be a lot of things you're going to have to give up. Habits you've developed over the years, ways of thinking, ways of speaking, ways of acting. You've got to exercise more restraint over them. One of the reactions that the Buddha has the monks think of every day is, now that I've changed my status, I have to change my way of acting. You look around, you see how the other monks are behaving, and, if it's not inspiring, you ask yourself, is that the way I behave? Do I still have some rough edges that I need to polish or lay down? And you learn to do this in a way where you don't feel like you have to hold yourself in and explode. You want to get to the root, i.e., to develop a skillful attitude, which is that you want true happiness, and that true happiness makes lots of demands. It's not that we just simply follow our own habitual nature, and everything's going to be nah. There are a lot of areas where the practice requires that we not follow our habits, that we not follow our strong urges. You can't think that the mind is naturally good, and so therefore you can trust everything that comes out of it when it quiets down. The mind has all kinds of potentials inside. Just because something feels natural or normal doesn't mean that it's going to be good for you. It's just what you've been accustoming yourself to. So whatever you have to give up, try to do it with an attitude of goodwill. Have some good humor about it as well. Learn to see the bad side of the habits you're having to abandon, so that you don't feel like you're giving up anything essential or valuable, anything really worth holding on to. After all, true happiness is not an easy thing. There are very quick pleasures you can get very easily, but they usually turn into something else. And pleasures that turn are like milk that turns. They don't turn into anything good. But genuine happiness is something else. It lasts. It doesn't turn. But it requires training. Goodwill is a form of concentration, and that requires restraint. You don't let your mind wander into other areas. If you do and some ill will creeping in, or the desire to do harm or to see somebody being harmed, or resentment or aversion, you've got to look into it for the purpose of training yourself out of it. You don't just spread thoughts of may all beings be happy, 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 happy. To smother it. That may work for a few minutes, but it doesn't really get to the problem, which is that you're holding on to some sort of attitude that's related to wrong view. And thinking that someone deserves to suffer is not a right view of any kind at all. The whole purpose of the teaching is that although people are suffering, they don't have to suffer. In other words, the Buddha's saying they don't deserve to suffer. Even though they've done bad in the past, that doesn't mean that they deserve to suffer. Even if you've done bad things in the past, you don't deserve to suffer. We can all change our ways. This is one of the basic assumptions that the Buddha worked on. If people couldn't change their ways, he said there would be no purpose in teaching them. But people can. They can learn to be more skillful and to drop unskillful things. So that's the attitude you should have toward everybody. If they're doing something really unskillful, make the wish, may they learn how to stop that. And if you're in a position to have any influence over that person, try to use it skillfully. If not, you just hold that thought in the mind to influence your own actions toward that person. Because the fact that the mind changes so easily means that you can't really trust it until you've reached at least the RST level of awakening. It can always turn around very quickly. So you've got to do whatever you can to make sure that you can really trust yourself. And one of the ways of doing that is by developing the restraint that comes with goodwill. You're not going to go into thoughts of ill will. Or if thoughts of ill will do come up, you're going to deal with them, try to root them out, because if you let any ill will linger in your mind, it might come out in ways that you might not anticipate. It comes out in times of weakness, times when you're feeling threatened. It comes out in times of fear. You've got to learn how to defend yourself from unskillful behavior that would come at any of those times, so that even when you're feeling weak and threatened and fearful, you hold on to the principle, I want genuine happiness, which may require some sacrifice. And number one is that you have to sacrifice anything unskillful you might do to get out of a difficult situation. There are some difficult situations you have to learn how to accept because you can't think of any skillful way out. In cases like that, you have to put up with the difficulty. You need to honor the principle of skillfulness more than your dislike of difficulty. That's a form of restraint that's hard but really important. One of the reasons the precepts are so simple is that when they're simple, they're easy to keep in mind. If they were very complex, your tendency to make excuses for yourself would slip into the folds of the complexity. You'd have to consult scholars at times when you don't have time to consult scholars when danger is staring you in the face, and you've got to make a decision right here, right now. And scholars who like to make the precepts complex shouldn't be trusted anyhow. So you simply keep remembering, I'm not going to do anything that's going to harm myself, and I'm not going to do anything that harms others. And it's interesting. From the Buddha's point of view, harming yourself means engaging in things like killing, stealing, having illicit sex, breaking any of the precepts. Harming others is getting them to do those things. In other words, you treat people not simply as objects of your actions. They're agents too. They have free will too. So you don't want to influence their choices in a bad way, because that's what's going to create suffering for them down the line. All this is very basic, but it's good to remember the basics every now and then, because it's very easy to cover up the basics with lots of rhetoric. Fancy words can sound very high and very noble. They can justify war, justify stealing, justify illicit sex, justify lying. The mind can create excuses for all kinds of behavior and make it sound very advanced and compassionate and spiritual. But it's not. Keep the basics in mind and try to keep your mind at a basic level. That way, it's hard to go wrong. So we don't pretend that we're all innately good or bad or that we're all one. Each of us has an element of free will that we have to respect. And each of us can do all kinds of things. In that possibility, you can see both danger and a potential for good. But to develop the potential for good, we have to keep the mind's potential to endanger itself in line. So we develop goodwill as a type of restraint. It gets the mind thinking in the right terms. In terms of the causes and effects of happiness. As for the case of resentment, in other words, the attitude that empathetic joy is supposed to overcome developing empathetic joy, teaches us there's nothing in the world worth resenting. We shouldn't see other people's good fortune as making anything less of us. We're not here to compete. We're here to work on our own unskillful habits and develop whatever skillful qualities we can. So resentment doesn't make any sense at all. When you can think in those terms, you can trust yourself a lot more. In alignment with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the tremendous significance of sharing wisdom widely. At present, we've converted this extensive 1,000-page work into a user-friendly audio format. The responsibility to advance this noble endeavor now lies with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's continue the age-old tradition of knowledge dissemination and the nurturing of mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We wholeheartedly invite you to join us in this undertaking, and together, we can effect profound and positive changes in the lives of many.